Have you ever felt alone, praying in the middle of the night, asking God to save something that seemed to be crumbling before your eyes? Have you ever cried silently while the person who promised to love you forever was in the arms of another? My name is Sarah Johnson. I'm 37 years old, and today I'm going to open my heart to tell you the most painful and at the same time most transformative story of my life. It's a story of betrayal, abandonment, judgment, and how I found strength in God to rise again when all seemed lost. When I got married, I believed my relationship would be an example of love and faith. I was that devoted wife, active in church, always ready to support her husband and care for the family. I believed that if I was faithful to God and my marriage, everything would be fine. But little by little, I began to notice signs I didn't want to see: distant looks, hidden messages, meaningless excuses. Maybe you felt that tightness in your chest, that feeling that something is wrong, but prefer to believe it's just an impression. Until the night that changed everything. While I prayed alone, on my knees, asking God to restore my home, He was elsewhere, with another woman. The pain of discovering this was unbearable. I felt small, humiliated, rejected, as if all my worth had been ripped away from me. And to make matters worse, what I found within the church itself was not acceptance, but judgmental looks, phrases that hurt even more. Pray more, be more submissive. Maybe you failed as a wife. If you've ever been through something like this, you know how heartbreaking it is. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because in the midst of the chaos, God taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. He showed me that even when everyone turns their backs, He remains. Stay with me until the end, because I want to tell you everything I experienced, from rock bottom to the moment I finally managed to get up and find the strong woman I always had inside me. I've always been that woman who believed in a marriage forever. I grew up hearing that if we did everything right, God would bless our home and nothing could shake us. I led the women's ministry at church, organized events, and counseled other wives on patience, faith, and obedience. To everyone, I seemed to have the perfect life: a caring husband, 2 beautiful children, a house full of laughter on Sundays after church. And for a long time, I truly believed it. My routine was dedicated to family. I woke up early, made coffee, helped the kids with school, took care of the house, and still found time to serve at church. Michael, my husband, was always respected in the community, seen as a man of faith, someone who prayed aloud and impressed everyone with his beautiful words. This made me feel even more proud to be his wife. I believed we had a purpose together, that our marriage was a mission, an example for other couples. But little by little, things began to change. It was as if small cracks were appearing in the walls of what I thought was solid. Michael started coming home late, saying he was overwhelmed with work. He began isolating himself, spending more time on his phone, always with the screen facing down. I tried not to overthink it. After all, no one wants to believe there's a hidden truth within their own home. I told myself it was just a phase, that everything would get better if I was patient and prayed more. I remember one particular night when, lying next to him, I felt like we were miles apart, even though we shared the same bed. I reached out, trying to connect, but he pretended to be asleep. It was as if, in that silent gesture, something inside me began to realize that there was much more going on behind the scenes in our marriage than I could have imagined. And so, without realizing it, I began a journey that would completely change my mindset about love, trust, and faith. A sequence of decisions and discoveries that would reveal a reality I never thought I'd face. I met Michael when I was just 20 years old. He was the kind of guy who drew attention not only for his appearance, but also for the way he spoke about God. Always confident, always surrounded by people, he was a respected young man in the church, seen as someone with a promising future. I, on the other hand, was more reserved, dedicated to Bible studies and ministry events. Our conversations began simply, exchanging ideas about youth plans and upcoming church projects. But little by little, we grew closer, discovering affinities, shared dreams, and most importantly, a similar vision for the future. I remember well the first time he talked to me about marriage. His eyes sparkled, and he said he wanted to build a family rooted in Christian values, raise children in faith, and build a home filled with purpose. That touched me deeply, because it felt like God was confirming that this was the man I would share my life with. When Michael proposed, I knew I was experiencing the answer to all my childhood prayers. Our wedding was beautiful, surrounded by blessings and prophetic words about a fruitful future. People looked at us and saw a perfect couple, the kind that inspires and seems destined for something great. I carried within me the conviction that we were beginning a special journey, a lifetime of spiritual achievements and fulfillment. Everything seemed so right, so aligned, that it never occurred to me that, behind that confident smile, there were areas of his life I hadn't yet truly understood. The first few years were filled with high expectations. We talked about mission projects, about starting a Bible study group, about being an example to other young couples. I believed that God had joined our lives together for a greater purpose, something that went far beyond ourselves. It was as if we were building something eternal, brick by brick, on a solid foundation of faith and commitment. But time passed, and I realized that some promises made at the beginning remained just words. Little by little, Michael began to get more involved in work, travel frequently, and seemed distant from the plans we once dreamed of together. It was as if that initial spark was fading, but I always found an excuse for his behavior. After all, I believed that every marriage goes through phases, and that with patience and prayer, everything would fall into place. What I didn't know was that while I clung to these convictions, a series of painful revelations was about to completely change the way I saw my husband, my marriage, and even myself. Looking back, I realize how immersed I was in a story that seemed perfect on the outside, but hid cracks that only I could see up close. Maybe you've experienced something like this too. That feeling that, to others, everything is fine, but inside the house, the truth is different. That's why I decided to share my story so honestly, because I know that many women carry silent pain, and sometimes all we need is to hear someone say, "I've been through this, I understand you." And if this conversation resonates with you, if it somehow touches your heart, leave a comment below with what has resonated most with you so far. Reading other women's experiences strengthens this community and shows that we are not alone on this journey. When you comment, like, and subscribe to the channel, you help me bring this message to more people who also need to hear that there is life and hope after pain. Your participation here is what keeps this space growing and reaching more women who may, right now, be experiencing the same reality I did. Sharing all this isn't easy, but I know each word can be a breath of fresh air for someone who's at their limit. And as I recall how everything began to change within me, I realized that it was precisely from that period of doubt and silence that my life took an unexpected turn. As the years passed, small changes began to bother me, but I always found a way to justify it. Michael, who was once attentive and present, began arriving home late, citing last-minute work commitments. Conversations between us diminished, hugs became rare, and his gaze, once so full of affection, seemed empty and distant. At night, when we lay in bed, I felt like there was an invisible wall between us, as if we were two strangers sharing the same space. His phone, which had previously been left lying around the house, was now always nearby, always face down. When he received messages, he'd leave the room to respond. I noticed all of this, but I told myself it was an exaggeration, that I was being insecure. It's amazing how, when we love someone, we tend to deceive ourselves to avoid the pain of the truth. The excuses became more frequent. Last-minute meetings, previously unplanned business trips, extreme exhaustion for any family time. Gradually, the prayers we used to say together ceased, and I became the only one to kneel at night. It was as if I were fighting alone for something that should have been ours. Still, I clung to the hope that it was all just a rough patch. On the surface, we remained the exemplary church couple. At events, he smiled, hugged me, and gave beautiful speeches about faith and family. But behind the scenes, when the doors closed, the reality was very different. I missed talking about our dreams, making plans together, feeling like we were a team. Little by little, I began to realize that the perfect life I'd so championed was just an image. Even with these clear signs, I chose not to see them. I told myself it was just stress, that everything would soon return to normal. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong, because that would mean facing a painful truth. And it was precisely in this attempt to keep up appearances that I ended up ignoring the first warnings that my story was about to change forever. Until one morning, everything changed. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up with a heavy heart, as if something was wrong. I got up slowly, went to the children's room, tucked them in gently, and knelt beside the bed to pray. I asked God for the strength to keep fighting for my marriage, asking Him to restore Michael's heart, to bring back the man I'd dreamed of growing old with. But in the middle of my prayer, I felt a strange silence in the house. I looked at his side of the bed and realized it was empty. At first, I tried to believe he'd simply gone to work on some urgent project. I called his cell phone, but there was no answer. I sent messages and stared at the screen, hoping for that read signal. The hours passed, and his phone remained off. It was as if every minute was a blow to my chest. The next day, he returned home as if nothing had happened. The scent of feminine perfume, unlike anything I knew, still lingered on his shirt. My heart sank. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the truth was screaming inside me. A few days later, an unexpected call dispelled all my doubts. A woman, her voice firm, told me she'd been seeing him for months. She said she was tired of being the other woman and that she deserved more than scraps of attention. In that moment, I felt as if the ground had dropped out from under my feet. The feeling of helplessness and humiliation was overwhelming. I remembered the early mornings I'd spent on my knees, praying for our home while he was with her. It was as if all my dedication, all the love, and the sacrifices I'd made for that relationship had been thrown away. The impact of this revelation was so strong that for a few seconds I remained in absolute silence, trying to process what I had just heard. I wanted to scream, cry, ask why, but nothing came out of my mouth. All I could feel was my heart racing, my breath shallow, and a mixture of anger and profound sadness. It was at that moment that I realized that the perfect image I had maintained no longer existed, and that from that moment on, my journey would take a turn I had never imagined. In that moment, I felt as if all my strength had left me. It was a void so deep it seemed impossible to fill. I stood there, with the truth stark before me, and at the same time, I felt small, weak, incapable of reacting. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, it was the feeling of complete abandonment. The person who promised to be by my side at all times had chosen to be elsewhere, with another woman, while I prayed alone, asking God to restore what He had already silently destroyed. Soon after, shame set in. Shame at imagining what people would say if they knew. Shame at looking at those same people at church who always saw us as the perfect couple. And deep down, a suffocating fear of being judged as the wife who couldn't hold on to her husband. I began to imagine the looks, the whispers, the phrases disguised as advice that, in reality, carried cruel criticism. It was as if my entire life was about to be exposed and analyzed by everyone while I struggled to simply keep from falling apart. This fear of judgment was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. I began to question whether I was enough, whether I had somehow failed as a wife, as a woman, as a Christian. With each thought, I felt my worth being slowly stripped away. It's amazing how, in these moments, the mind creates traps that make us believe lies about who we are. The hidden truth is that I wasn't to blame for what he did, but at that moment, I couldn't see it. There were days when I just wanted to disappear, to run away from it all, as if that could erase the pain. Other times, I found myself wishing it was just a nightmare, and that when I woke up, everything would be the same. But reality was there, raw, impossible to deny, and deep down, I knew that from that point on, my journey would never be the same. The life I knew was over, and I would have to deal with the consequences of decisions that weren't my own. When I finally summoned the courage to seek help within the church, what I found was not acceptance, but silence and judgment. I remember the first time I approached one of the most respected women in the ministry to open my heart. With tears in my eyes, I told her everything that was happening, hoping to hear words of support or, at the very least, a sincere hug. But her response was like a knife in the back. "You need to pray more, Sarah. Maybe you're failing as a wife. A man only seeks another woman when something is missing at home." Those words echoed in my mind for days, as if it were all my fault. I felt diminished, as if I were responsible for his infidelity. It wasn't long before other comments began to surface, always laden with a judgmental tone, disguised as advice. Be more submissive. Take better care of your husband. Be more patient. It was as if the entire weight of the betrayal was placed on me, while he continued to be seen as the exemplary leader, the man of faith, the husband everyone admired. I then realized how lonely the position of a woman who suffers in silence within her own church can be. Instead of support, we often receive labels and accusations that hurt even more. I, who had always believed in the importance of community, found myself isolated, afraid to speak out, afraid of being exposed. What I wanted most was a safe place to cry, to be heard without judgment, but it seemed everyone was more concerned with keeping up appearances than dealing with the truth. This experience made me see something I hadn't wanted to admit until then. There was a hidden truth behind that image of perfection we so cherish. While families smiled at services, many women were there, suffering in silence, believing their pain was the result of a personal failure. This realization profoundly affected my mindset. I was still devastated by the betrayal, but I was beginning to understand that if I wanted to start over, I would need to break free from that invisible prison that kept me silent. Little by little, that judgmental silence began to truly suffocate me. I found myself smiling at people, trying to act natural, but inside, I was completely shattered. There were nights when I locked myself in the bathroom to cry quietly, afraid of waking the children. The mirror seemed to reflect a stranger, someone with no sparkle in her eyes, without the strength to continue pretending everything was okay. It was during this period that I began to doubt my own worth. I, who had always believed myself to be a strong, dedicated, and God-fearing woman, now felt small, invisible, and incapable of deserving love or respect. I began to question my identity, my femininity, and even my faith. I felt as if, besides losing my husband, I was losing myself. I remember thinking, does God still see me? Does he still care about me? It was incredibly painful to feel that, despite serving so many years in the church, counseling other women, I was now completely alone in the most difficult time of my life. It was as if all the certainties I had built had crumbled, one by one. I began to blame myself absurdly, trying to find some reason to explain what had happened. I began to believe the harsh words I heard from some people, as if I had truly failed as a wife. This led me to such a state of exhaustion that I no longer felt like praying or fighting. Those were dark days, when my mind felt like a prison. I'd wake up and feel a huge weight on my chest, as if I were about to collapse at any moment. Everything inside me screamed for help, but at the same time, I was afraid to ask for help and be judged again. With each tear, I realized I was losing pieces of myself, as if my identity were falling apart. It was at that point that I realized something inside me needed to change, that I couldn't go on like this forever. I didn't know how yet, but I felt that somehow God would lead me to a transformation I had never imagined I would experience. Nothing could have prepared me for that night. I still remember every detail: the sound of the door opening, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, and the cold expression on his face when he entered the room. There was something different in Michael's gaze, as if, in that moment, he was no longer the man I knew. He sat across from me, took a deep breath, and with a calmness that cut through me even more, said the words that would change my life forever. "Sarah, I don't love you anymore. I want to live my freedom, make my own choices, without having to think of anyone but myself." It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I felt my entire body tremble, my breath falter, and for a few seconds, I was completely unresponsive. It was as if each of his words were a knife stabbing me in different places, ripping away everything I believed to be real. I tried to say something, to beg him to think about the children, about everything we had built together, but he was determined. The man with whom I had shared so many dreams was no longer there. In his place was someone who seemed willing to destroy everything in the name of a distorted idea of freedom. The pain in that moment was indescribable. It was as if not only my heart had been ripped out, but also my soul. Within minutes, I felt my entire story had been invalidated, that the years of surrender, renunciation, and prayer simply meant nothing to him. I looked into his eyes, searching for a shred of regret, of love, of anything that might give me hope, but all I found was coldness. That night I cried until I had no more strength. I felt as if I had lost not only my husband, but myself, my identity, my security, everything. It was the most devastating point in my journey, the moment I realized that the life I knew had just crumbled before me. Yet, in the midst of all that pain, something inside me began to stir silently, as if God were preparing me for a transformation I had never imagined. After that night, my life became a silent chaos. I spent entire days unable to eat properly, and the nights were the worst. I would lie down and stare at the ceiling, my mind spinning endlessly, trying to understand where everything had gone. Every detail, every memory, every promise made at the altar seemed to haunt me. Within a few months, I lost so much weight that I could barely recognize myself in the mirror. My skin reflected exhaustion. My eyes were perpetually red from crying, and I no longer had the energy to even take care of myself. What consumed me most was the cruel irony of the situation. While I was still on my knees praying for him, he was in the arms of another woman. It was as if, with each prayer, I was reminded that my words weren't changing anything. The emptiness of doing everything right and still losing everything gnawed at me. I felt like I was being punished for something I couldn't quite grasp. I began avoiding social gatherings, church services, any situation where I might be questioned about my marriage. The feeling of being watched, of being the target of veiled comments, made me want to disappear. Even the simplest things, like making breakfast for the kids, required enormous effort. I felt like a shadow of the woman I had once been. There were times when I thought I would never recover. The weight of rejection and betrayal was so great that it seemed impossible to imagine a future without pain. But, paradoxically, it was precisely at that rock bottom that something began to change within me. Amidst all that despair, I began to realize that, even broken, I was still standing. And this realization, so simple and so powerful, was like a spark of hope I hadn't expected to find at that moment. One cold dawn, when the silence felt heavier than ever, I reached my breaking point. I was kneeling on the bedroom floor, surrounded by memories that insisted on tormenting me, and I felt I no longer had the strength to fight the pain. My hands trembled, and the tears flowed uncontrollably, but for the first time, I stopped praying for Michael to return. Instead, with a broken voice, I said something that completely changed the course of my life. "Thy will be done. If I have to start over, teach me to live again." At that moment, something inexplicable happened. It wasn't as if a miracle had solved all my problems at once, but I felt a silent peace invade my heart, as if God were saying to me, "I never left you." It was at that moment that I realized how much I had tried to control everything, even God's will, in the hopes of keeping my marriage intact. For the first time, I truly surrendered my story into His hands, even without knowing what the next day would bring. After that prayer, things weren't magical or easy, but my mindset began to shift. I began to understand that starting over wasn't a sign of weakness, but an act of courage. Little by little, that flame of hope that seemed extinguished began to rekindle. I began to remember who I was before all of this, a strong, dreamy, faith-filled woman who had been called to much more than living in the shadow of someone who had chosen to abandon me. There were still many tears, many difficult days, but something in me had changed forever. I stopped looking back, hoping the past would return, and started looking forward, even though I was afraid, even though I didn't have all the answers. It was a slow process made of small daily decisions: getting out of bed, getting ready, feeding myself, taking care of the children, praying for myself again, not for him. Each step seemed small, but it had a huge impact on how I saw myself. I also began to realize hidden truths I hadn't previously wanted to face. The image of perfection I'd tried to maintain for so long had imprisoned me. I understood that many women, like me, lived behind the scenes of hidden pain, trying to appear strong while crumbling inside. This revelation was hard, but necessary, because it showed me that I wasn't alone. There were many other women needing to find the same courage to start over. During that time, I felt God leading me in a new way, as if He were rebuilding every broken piece of my heart. It was from that sincere prayer that a new journey began, a journey of liberation and profound discovery about who I truly was and the purpose He still had for me. And, strange as it may seem, it was on that cold floor, with my face wet, with tears, that I took my first step toward the life I didn't even know I could still live. After that early morning, when I finally surrendered everything to God, something began to change within me. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a profound process, almost invisible to outsiders. I still cried. I still had days when I felt weak and directionless. But now there was a silent certainty in my heart. I was not alone. I began to seek out daily moments of prayer that were no longer desperate pleas for Him to return. I spoke to God about myself, about my wounds, about the emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. And little by little, I began to feel something new. It was as if He were reminding me every day that I still had value, that my identity wasn't tied to being the wife of someone who had chosen to abandon me. This realization was liberating. For the first time in a long time, I was able to look in the mirror and see myself as a beloved daughter of God, not as the rejected woman. The healing process was full of revelations that changed my mindset. I realized how many times I had tried to sustain a crumbling marriage alone, believing that all I had to do was sacrifice a little more and everything would return to normal. I understood that for years I had confused submission with self-denial, as if loving meant ceasing to exist completely. When this hidden truth came to light, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for having lost myself, but relief for finally seeing reality clearly. There were days when God reminded me of my worth in unexpected ways. A conversation with a friend, a message I read in the Bible, a song of praise that seemed to speak directly to me. Small signs that showed He was rebuilding me from within. It was an intimate, silent process, but with a huge impact on my way of life. Every prayer, every tear, every decision to move forward, even when everything seemed difficult, was like a new brick being laid in the reconstruction of my life. During this time, I also began to see the behind-the-scenes stories of many around me. Women who, like me, smiled to the world while secretly carrying enormous pain. This made me understand that sharing my journey could be more than just a way to vent. It could be a tool of transformation for others. Little by little, the pain began to give way to a new strength. It wasn't the strength of someone trying to prove something to others, but the strength of someone who finally discovers who they are in God. I learned to make small decisions that previously seemed impossible. I started taking better care of myself, going for walks, reading books that helped me understand my worth, and reclaiming dreams that had fallen by the wayside. It was through this process that I realized that healing wasn't just emotional, but also spiritual. God wasn't just comforting me, He was rebuilding me and preparing me for a new journey. Each step along this path was a revelation about the woman I could be without carrying guilt that was never mine. It wasn't a matter of simply getting over what happened, but of allowing myself to be reborn with a new mindset. I understood that what had happened didn't define my future, and that betrayal wasn't the final chapter of my story. And it was at this point, amid my daily prayers and discoveries, that I began to feel a much greater calling arising within me, as if God were showing me that there was a special purpose in everything I had experienced. Facing judgment and silence from people who once walked with me in faith was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I always believed that church was the place where we would find support in the most difficult moments. But when my life fell apart, I realized that religious environments can often become a space of cold stares, empty advice, and blame-laden phrases. I heard things like, "You need to pray more. Perhaps you lack wisdom as a wife," and even, "A wise woman builds a home. Have you done your part?" Each of these words was like a new wound being opened, just when I needed comfort the most. For a time, I fell silent. I stopped going to meetings, avoided church events, and hid. The fear of being seen as the woman who failed at marriage made me feel smaller and smaller. It was as if everything I had built there had disappeared. Friends drifted away. Some simply pretended I didn't exist. The silence hurt as much as the direct criticism. But in the midst of this solitude, God began to teach me something precious. My faith should never be based on people, but on Him. It was a profound revelation that completely changed the way I viewed the Christian life. This new realization brought me an unexpected sense of freedom. When I understood that other people's opinions couldn't define my worth, I began to see myself differently. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I began to seek God in a different way, more intimate, without masks. My prayers stopped being attempts to prove something to Him and became sincere conversations in which I truly opened my heart. At the same time, I saw behind the scenes of all that was happening. Many of the people who judged me carried hidden stories, unresolved pain. It was then that I realized how a lack of empathy within the church can further crush those who are already hurt. This made me reflect on the kind of Christian woman I wanted to be from then on. Someone who welcomes, not someone who condemns. I won't say it was easy to deal with every mean comment or lost friendship. There were days when I cried alone, wondering if I would ever feel part of something bigger again. But little by little, God showed me that He Himself was leading me on a new path. I began to draw closer to people who truly lived the essence of the gospel, those who helped me understand that being a Christian is, above all, carrying the love of Christ in our daily lives. This shift in mindset was essential to my transformation. I realized that my faith couldn't be a reflection of people's approval or disapproval, but rather a genuine relationship with God. And it was in this process of rebuilding that I realized something powerful. I no longer needed to seek validation in human eyes. My identity was secure in Him. Over time, my pain gave way to new meanings. What once seemed like mere rejection now transformed into profound lessons about forgiveness, grace, and resilience. I learned that when we let go of the need to please everyone, we can live a much truer and freer faith. This learning experience strengthened me in ways I never imagined possible. I began to make different decisions, set boundaries, and care more about those I allowed into my heart. And with that, I realized that the rejection I so feared was actually an opportunity for God to show me who truly should be by my side on this new journey. And it was at that point that something even deeper began to happen within me. The desire to simply survive gave way to a calling to live with purpose. I understood that all that pain, every tear, every sleepless night, was being used by God to teach me, to prepare me for something greater. And almost silently, I realized that He was leading me to a new phase, a phase in which I would not only rise again, but also be used to reach other women who, like me, felt alone and invisible. That's when I began to realize there was a much greater purpose to this entire journey. And deep down, I knew this would just be the beginning of a completely different story than the one I'd imagined for myself. And that's why I share all of this with such transparency today, because I know that somewhere there's someone experiencing the same pain I did, carrying the same weight, believing they're alone in this battle. Perhaps you're hearing this story and seeing a glimpse of your own life here. If that's you, know that you're not alone. This space was created precisely so we can exchange experiences, support each other, and show that there is life after pain. There is a new beginning after loss. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most, what part of the story spoke most to your heart, or even something you've experienced and want to share. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, which is so often overlooked within the church, but needs to be shared with love and truth. It's through your comments that this conversation becomes even more alive, and that other women find the courage to open their hearts and realize they're not alone. Every story shared here has a huge impact, because when you write, someone reads it and relates, someone finds the strength to carry on. That's what transforms this space into something much bigger than just a video. It becomes a community of faith, empathy, and real hope. And it was in this movement of exchange, healing, and rebuilding that I began to understand that God was taking me to a completely new place. A place where my story was no longer just about pain, but also about purpose, about liberation, and about how grace can give new meaning to even the most devastating losses. Starting over wasn't simple or quick. It was a process full of ups and downs, difficult decisions, and moments when I had to face the hidden truth about myself. I had spent so much time trying to be the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the exemplary leader, that I had forgotten who I was beyond these roles. It was painful to admit this, but also liberating. Little by little, I began rebuilding my life in small steps, rediscovering dreams I had left behind, investing in things that brought me genuine joy, and learning to take care of myself without guilt. I remember the first time I went back to school. I sat in that classroom full of younger people and thought, is there still time for me? It was a huge challenge to change my mindset and believe that my worth wasn't lost. Every decision, no matter how small, had a profound impact on me because it showed me that I could indeed write a new story. Working again brought me dignity, independence, and the feeling that I was taking control of my journey. With my children, I learned to be more present in a different way. No longer the mother who carried the burden of maintaining a perfect image, but a real mother, one who talks, who makes mistakes, who asks for forgiveness, who shows vulnerability. They saw the behind the scenes of my transformation up close, and this further strengthened our bond. Instead of hiding my tears, I learned to teach through them, showing that pain can be an instrument of growth when we don't allow ourselves to be paralyzed by it. There were days when I still woke up scared, unsure about the future, wondering if I could really move forward. But in those moments, I remembered God's promises and the strength He had already given me. It was as if, with each step, He showed me new revelations about who I was in Him and the abundant life I could have. Even after so much suffering, I began to see myself differently, as someone capable, loved, and deserving of a full life. This shift in perspective was key to everything. I stopped looking back with resentment and began to be grateful for what I had learned. I discovered that freedom lay not only in being freed from a relationship that was destroying me, but in rediscovering my identity and purpose. And before I knew it, I was no longer the same woman who had once cried on the ground, begging for strength to survive. I had become stronger, more aware of who I was, and most importantly, more confident that there was still much to come. Each day became a new opportunity to live with gratitude, to be an example to my children, and to demonstrate, in practice, that God specializes in transforming painful endings into hopeful beginnings. This journey didn't erase the scars of the past, but it showed me that they can tell a story of overcoming. Because today, looking back, I realized that those wounds were what prepared me to live a new chapter, one that's truer, lighter, and more meaningful. And it was precisely during this process of rebuilding that I understood something that completely changed my perspective on new beginnings and what it truly means to live a full and restored life. One of the most profound lessons I learned from this journey was understanding that forgiveness is not a gift to those who hurt us, but to ourselves. Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was right, nor is it about ignoring the pain we feel. It's actually an act of courage and freedom. It's like opening a door to a prison where we've been locked up for so long, finally breathing fresh air. I realized that while I harbored resentment, hurt, and the need to prove something to him or to the people who judged me, I remained trapped in the past. Forgiveness was the decisive step that freed me from what kept me chained. This understanding came gradually, through many sincere conversations with God and my own heart. There were days when I needed to say out loud, I choose to forgive, even though I still feel pain. And surprisingly, over time, the wound healed. I discovered that forgiveness is also a daily decision, because memory can try to pull us back, but the choice to be free must be greater than the memory of the pain. Another important revelation was realizing that I didn't need to compare myself to anyone. Each person has their own story, their own behind-the-scenes story, their own hidden battles that no one sees. The truth hidden behind many smiles is that almost everyone carries scars and challenges. When I understood this, I stopped seeking approval in looks and opinions and began to value what God said about me. This change in mindset gave me the strength to move forward without needing to explain my decisions or justify my journey to those who have never experienced my pain. I also learned to redefine what happiness means. Before, I thought happiness was about having a perfect marriage in the eyes of others, about fulfilling a list of expectations imposed by society or the church. Today, I know that happiness is having peace, sleeping soundly, knowing I'm true to who I truly am, being surrounded by those who truly love me. It's living a life that makes sense for me and my children, without carrying burdens that were never mine. This journey has shown me the impact our choices have, even the small ones. Each step toward healing was a conscious decision to not let pain define me. And this has transformed not only me, but also the way my children see me, and even how I relate to the people around me. I've come to appreciate the simple moments more, to celebrate achievements I previously didn't even notice, and to take pride in every victory, no matter how small. I look back and see that everything that once broke me was actually what prepared me to be who I am today. I'm not perfect, but I'm whole. I don't have all the answers, but I have an unshakable faith that all things work together for good for those who trust in God. These lessons taught me that life can always begin again, even when it seems like everything has come to an end. And perhaps this is the greatest revelation of all, realizing that behind every pain, there is an opportunity for transformation. We just need to have the courage to take the first step, to let go of what holds us back, and to believe that we deserve to experience something new, without fear, without shame, and without the chains of the past that insist on pulling us back. Because it is precisely in this place of surrender and trust that God begins to write the most beautiful chapters of our story. If I could look into the eyes of every woman today who is experiencing something similar to what I experienced, I would tell them that the pain that seems unbearable does not define who you are. I know what it's like to feel like the ground has disappeared, what it's like to wake up with a heavy heart and think that no one will ever understand the depth of your wound. I know what it's like to feel ashamed of something you didn't cause, to carry guilt that isn't yours, and yet believe that perhaps I truly wasn't enough. I've been in that dark place, where the voices around me only reinforced that I should have been more this or less that, and where even prayers seemed to echo in the void. But I learned, in a harsh and transformative way, that the hidden truth behind all this pain is that it can become the beginning of a new story. Because when everything seems to have been ripped away from you, that's when there's room for something completely new to blossom. It was precisely at this point that I discovered that God had never abandoned me, even when I thought He was silent. It was as if He were sustaining me in secret, preparing my heart to understand that I didn't need to beg for love where it never truly existed. I would say to you who are listening to me now that every tear you shed is not in vain, that there is a purpose amidst this chaos, and that the pain that seems to crush you today will, one day, be the strength that lifts you up. Because no one emerges from an experience like this the same person. There is a transformation that occurs in the soul when we decide not to get lost in the midst of the storm. It's not about forgetting what happened, nor about pretending everything is fine. It's about deciding that pain will not have the final word. Maybe you don't see a way out now, but I'm living proof that there's life after the destruction of dreams. I once felt worthless. I once thought my future was destroyed, but I discovered that my identity didn't depend on what they did to me, but on who God said I was. This completely changed my mindset, because I realized I'm not defined by abandonment, betrayal, or the judgment of people who never knew my struggles. So, if I could hold your hands right now, I'd tell you, don't give up on yourself. Don't accept the lies that tell you you have to be perfect to deserve love. You are enough, just as you are, even if you have scars, even if you're tired and weak. These marks that hurt today are part of your story, but they're not the end of it. And I know hearing this now might seem impossible to believe, but one day you'll look back and realize that the version of you that survived all of this was much stronger than you imagined, that even behind the scenes of pain, there was a God at work, organizing every detail, preparing you for a life that would make sense again. I also know that people's judgments weigh heavily. I know what it's like to fear stares and comments, as if everyone has the right to give their opinion on a life you haven't lived. But the truth is, when you understand that your faith is in God and not in people, other people's opinions no longer have power over you. This was one of the greatest revelations of my journey, realizing that pleasing everyone is impossible, but living in alignment with God's plan for us is liberating. So if there's one thing I'd like you to hold close to your heart today, it's that you're not alone. You can start over, make new choices, and rebuild your life on much more solid foundations than before. This doesn't mean it will be easy or quick, but it does mean it's possible. And in the end, you'll discover that you're much stronger, more resilient, and more precious than you ever imagined. And it's precisely this certainty that drives me to share my story here, because I know that one word can have a huge impact on the lives of those on the verge of giving up. Sometimes, all we need is a sign that we're not the only ones going through this, that there's a way forward even when there seems to be no way out. And I want to be that voice that reminds you that there's still hope, even when all seems lost. Today, when I reflect on everything that happened, I realize that betrayal wasn't the final sentence in my story. It was, in fact, the turning point that showed me I could rise from the ashes. At that moment, it seemed impossible to believe that anything good could emerge from so much pain, but it was precisely in the chaos that I found the strength to rebuild myself. And the most impressive thing is realizing how God used even my greatest wounds to write new chapters, full of meaning and purpose. I remember how many times I questioned why me, why my family, why my life had been turned upside down. Today I understand that it wasn't about punishment or deserving it, but about a process of transformation that would make me see life differently. I needed to go through the darkness to recognize the value of the light. I needed to lose what I thought was essential to discover what truly mattered. And that's how I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving the person who hurt me, but about freeing myself from the prison of hurt. It was about deciding that I wouldn't be held hostage by what happened, that my identity wouldn't be tied to what was done to me. This completely changed my mindset, because I realized that holding a grudge is like taking poison and expecting the other person to suffer the consequences. True freedom came when I understood that I could move forward, regardless of whether or not the person who hurt me regretted it. I look back and see the woman who once felt small, worthless, afraid to start over, and I compare her to the woman I am today, not perfect, but more aware of who she is, more firm in her decisions, and most importantly, more certain that she doesn't need anyone's approval to be happy. This journey wasn't quick or easy, but every step was worth it. There were days when all I could do was cry, nights when it seemed impossible to believe that tomorrow would be different. But little by little, God was rebuilding the broken parts of my heart and showing me that there was still much more to live for. The most beautiful thing is that even without realizing it, during this process, I became an inspiration to other women. Those who saw me as broken now seek me out to learn how I managed to get back on my feet. And I always say that there's no magic formula, that there's no path without pain, but that the decision not to give up on yourself changes absolutely everything. Because a new beginning doesn't happen overnight. It's built with small daily choices, deciding to get out of bed, deciding to take care of yourself, deciding to believe that life can still be good. It was on this path that I discovered a hidden and powerful truth. Pain can be the beginning of a new version of ourselves, stronger, more aware, and freer. If before I lived trying to please, prove my worth, or live up to others' expectations, today I know that my value lies in the simple fact of existing, of being a beloved daughter of God. I don't need to carry labels or be tied to the past to have a fulfilling life. And perhaps this is the greatest revelation of all I've experienced. The betrayal that seemed like the end was just the beginning of a journey I never would have chosen, but one that led me to a much deeper place of self-knowledge and faith. I discovered that being strong isn't about never falling, but choosing to get up every time. I learned that happiness isn't about the absence of pain, but the courage to carry on despite it. And that's why, if I could leave a message engraved in the heart of every woman listening to me right now, it would be this: you are much stronger than you imagine. Don't believe the lie that your life is over because of what happened. There is a future full of possibilities waiting for you. Not because it will be easy or without challenges, but because you are capable of transforming even the greatest pain into stepping stones to your new story. Every tear you cried, every desperate prayer, every lonely night, none of it was in vain. It all brought you here, and it's from here that your life can begin to be rebuilt. You are not a mistake, not what was done to you, nor the harsh words you heard. You are precious, and you deserve to live a life full of meaning and joy again. And when I think about all this, my heart fills with gratitude, because I understand that the woman I am today only exists because the woman I was yesterday had the courage to keep going, even when she was powerless. That's true strength, keeping going even when everything tells me to give up. And it's precisely at this point that I realize my story isn't over, that there are still beautiful chapters being written, and that each step I take on this journey brings me closer to the abundant life God has always dreamed for me. And perhaps now, listening to all this, you can see yourself somewhere in my story. Maybe it wasn't a betrayal, but perhaps a loss, a rejection, a frustration that seemed to rob you of your ground and your plans. Each of us carries our own scars, but what unites us is this feeling of powerlessness in the face of what we cannot control, and the decision to, nonetheless, keep walking. And that's why I believe so strongly in the power of sharing real stories, with glimpses of pain and also of overcoming, because they remind us that we are not alone on this journey. Sometimes, all we need is to hear someone say, "I went through that too. I thought I couldn't handle it, but I survived." This identification is powerful because it shows us that there is hope, even when life presents us with chapters we would never choose to write. That's exactly what strengthened me along the way, knowing that other people, with their hidden truths, also faced moments of profound despair and found in God the strength to begin again. I always wonder what it would have been like if, back then, someone had looked me in the eye and told me that the pain wasn't eternal, that one day I would truly smile again. Maybe I would have clung to that word like a beacon in the midst of a storm. That's why, today, I insist on being that voice for those who need to hear it. You are not what happened to you. Your identity isn't found in failure, loss, or what was done to you. There is immense value in simply existing, in being who you are, and in allowing God to write a new story, even after everything. And I like to think that when we open our hearts and share our experiences, we create a space for real connection. It's in this space that we can encourage each other, learn together, and discover that, even in the most painful falls, there's something greater sustaining us. If this topic in any way resonates with your story, if any part of what I shared resonated with you, I'd like to know. Sometimes, a simple sentence from you can become a source of hope for another woman who reads the comments and realizes she's not alone. When you share your story, your opinion, or even a word of support here, it not only strengthens this community, but helps carry this message even further. Your participation has a real impact, because when we add our voices, we can reach people who, at this very moment, may be experiencing the depths of the pit we all know. So if you feel it in your heart, write here what touched you most, or how God has helped you rise again during difficult times. This is the kind of exchange that transforms not only my life, but also the lives of those who read it and find strength through your experience. And it's in this movement of sharing, of opening up, that we realize there's no weakness in exposing our pain. In fact, there's immense strength in recognizing that we're human, that we fall, but that we have the courage to get back up. That's how I discovered that, even after loss, life still holds new opportunities, unexpected encounters, new beginnings we never imagined. And I'm certain that just as God sustained me, He can sustain you too, no matter what battle you're facing. Because in the end, it's not just about my story or yours, but about how together we build a chain of hope. Each story, each word of faith, each testimony becomes a powerful reminder that there is always a way, even when all seems lost. And it is precisely in this exchange that we find new meaning in the pain we experience. It becomes an instrument of healing for others. As I write and share this with you, my heart fills with gratitude, knowing that nothing I've experienced has been in vain. It was all part of a journey that brought me here, and now, more than ever, I know my mission is to use each healed wound as proof that God can transform any story. And it is with this purpose that I continue, certain that there is still much to be said, many truths to be revealed, and many hearts waiting to hear that they, too, can begin anew. And you know what I've realized over time? That every time someone has the courage to share what God has done in their life, that story becomes a breath of hope for those still in the midst of the storm. I myself have been sustained by testimonies like these, from women who opened their hearts and shared their experiences of pain and transformation. So, if there's something you've experienced, a new beginning, an unexpected turnaround in which you clearly felt God's care, share it here in the comments. You may not realize it, but your experience could be exactly the answer to prayer someone is waiting for right now. It's so beautiful to see how He uses our scars to heal others, how what once made us cry becomes a source of comfort and strength for those still learning to walk. When you write, you become an active part of this chain of faith, showing that the impossible can happen, that there is life after loss, that pain is not the end of the story. It is from this sincere exchange that a strong community is born, where each word is a seed planted in the heart of the reader. And if this story resonated with you, be sure to check out the other accounts on this channel. They're true stories, full of hidden truths and revelations that show how God specializes in transforming sad endings into new beginnings. Perhaps in one of these accounts, you'll find just the right phrase that will touch your soul, bringing clarity to a decision or courage to take the next step on your own journey. It's amazing how, when we open ourselves to hearing other stories, we see details we hadn't noticed in our own journey. Sometimes it's in someone else's story that we understand we don't need to have all the answers, that all we have to do is trust and keep going. Each testimony here is proof that even when all seems lost, God continues to write chapters we haven't yet seen. So, if you feel it in your heart, participate. Leave your comment, read other women's stories, and allow yourself to be inspired. This space isn't just about me. It's about us. About each woman who decides not to remain silent in the face of pain, but to transform her own journey into hope for someone else. And while you do so, I invite you to delve into the other videos here. Each one is a powerful reminder that a new beginning is always possible, that the right mindset, faith, and the courage to take a step forward can change everything. And so, together, we continue to strengthen this movement of faith and transformation, unhurriedly, but with the certainty that each shared story is a flame lit amid someone's darkness. Because deep down, this is what keeps us going, knowing that our lives have an impact, that our testimony can echo beyond ourselves and reach hearts we may never meet personally, but that will be touched by the simple act of sharing what once saved us.